Hey, it's noon, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Whitkin State Law Library, part of the California State Library, for a special program on legal and social implications of generative AI with Professor Peter Lee of UC Davis. My name is Elena Smith, and I'm the host of today's event. I'm a reference and outreach librarian in the Whitkin State Law Library of the California State Library. We also have two co-hosts today, Vanessa Chrisman, who is the principal librarian for our law and government publications sections, and Kimberly Sims, one of my fellow reference librarians in law. Vanessa will be monitoring our Q&A section throughout the talk for any questions you may have for Professor Lee, and she will read your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This program would not be possible without the support of the California State Library Foundation, for which we are eternally grateful. To learn more about the foundation, you can visit their website at cslfdn.org. Before I go any farther into our program introduction, I also want to acknowledge that I am working on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Nisenan and Miwok peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. As such, I am a guest on this land, and I want to acknowledge, thank, and honor my hosts. The California State Library is thrilled to have Professor Peter Lee of UC Davis here to explore aspects of the legal and social questions that surround generative AI. It promises to be an exciting and interesting talk. To make sure you have the best experience possible, I'm going to go over a few technical housekeeping details, and then we'll get into the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section, and we will answer them at the end of the program during our Q&A session. This presentation will be recorded and made available after the talk. Live transcriptions is enabled, so if you would like to see the captions, click the CC icon to show subtitles. If you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section, and we will try to help you if we can. We've added links related to the California State Library and Professor Peter Lee in the chat window. For any state employees without a library card, please consider applying for one through the posted online application link, and don't forget to register for one of the State Library's many other speaker programs. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get to the main event. Professor Peter Lee teaches and writes in the field of innovation law and policy. His research focuses on patent law and other fields of intellectual property, technology transfer, artificial intelligence, and science policy. Professor Peter Lee is an elected member of the American Law Institute, and he has received numerous awards for his scholarly work, including the UC Davis Chancellor's Fellowship, the Samson Stanford Patent Prize, and inclusion in West Thompson's annual Intellectual Property Law Review. He speaks widely on intellectual property matters in the United States and abroad, and is the founding director of the Center for Innovation, Law, and Society at UC Davis. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Lee.
All right, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I want to thank the Whitkin State Law Library and all of you for joining us today. So this is going to be a talk on legal and social implications of generative AI. All right, so we are living amidst the generative AI revolution. So this technology is truly taking the world by storm. So we're going to get into what generative AI actually is, but for present purposes, we're talking about artificial intelligence models trained on huge amounts of data. And these models can generate novel text, images, videos, audio, software code, etc. Right? So it generates content. And just to give you one example of the pervasiveness of this technology, 2 months after its launch in late 2022, OpenAI's ChatGPT had reached 100 million users. So by many estimates, the fastest growing consumer application really in history. And so today we're going to explore some of the legal and social implications of this transformative technology. All right, so let me give you a roadmap of what I'd like to cover today. So I want to start with some context and definition. So obviously this is a very technical area. I'm not going to get too much into the technical weeds. We have to understand something about this technology to understand its legal and social implications. So I then want to talk a bit about inputs and challenges that arise from generative AI training data. So as we're going to discuss, these models use enormous amounts of training data, and this gives rise to certain challenges. I'll talk about three of them. Uh, Copyright infringement, the prospect of privacy violations, and bias. So I'm then going to transition to talking more directly about the outputs of these AI models. I'll talk about the effects of generative AI outputs and the implications of this technology for productivity and employment, misinformation, disinformation, and fraud, and then authorship and inventorship. So issues relating to intellectual property ownership of the content produced by generative AI. So I'm going to end the talk by kind of bring things full circle by addressing outputs as inputs. So I'll talk a bit about generative AI as actually creating synthetic data that can train other AI models. And so I'll mention at the outset, there are lots of other areas as well that we're not going to have time to explore, but these are some prominent issues with respect to the social and legal implications of generative AI. All right, so let's delve in. Let me provide a bit of context and we'll deal with some definitions. So obviously we're talking about artificial intelligence or AI. This technology has been around for decades. There are lots of ways of defining this. This is one kind of working definition we can adopt today. So AI refers to the use of technology to automate tasks that normally require human intelligence. And we're going to focus today on a subset of AI, which is generative AI. So this is a type of artificial intelligence that generates new content based on models that have been trained on data. And so, as I mentioned earlier, lots of different types of content can be generated: text, images, videos, audio, software code, etc. And there are many, many generative AI apps that are already in wide use. So we have chatbots like ChatGPT. We have text-to-image generators like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion. Gemini is kind of Google's answer kind of to compete against ChatGPT. We have GitHub Copilot, which can actually generate software code, right? So an enormous amount of variety of content is created by generative AI models. All right, so a term that you may have heard about is machine learning. So generative AI is a type of machine learning. And in general, these are computer techniques that detect and learn from patterns in large amounts of data. Now, this seems very technologically sophisticated, but we're actually quite familiar with machine learning. I, in fact, interact with machine learning every day. So consider your email spam filter, right? So, the spam filter can read the content of your messages, obviously determine who it comes from, and based on how you've dealt with messages like this in the past, it might divert some of them into your spam filter. It's learning from enormous amounts of data. This is also evident for any of you who watch Netflix, right? So, Netflix keeps track of the programs that you watch, how frequently you watch them, and they can generate recommendations for programs you might like based on that data. So on the theme of data, I want to focus for a moment on training data. So training data is very important for understanding how generative AI models work. This is the data that actually trains an AI model. So let's consider an example outside of the context of generative AI. Let's talk about autonomous vehicles, right? So cars that can drive themselves, which is another form of artificial intelligence. So how do they learn how to do this? Well, their training data is millions of miles actually driving around on roads, actually with sensors, gathering information. All of this helps train the model that allows these autonomous vehicles to drive. If we shift in the context of generative AI, training data might be basically the entire content of the internet. And in fact, we're going to see that the internet is a very important source of training data for generative AI. All right, so let's talk for a moment about models. So models are programs that use algorithms and data to identify patterns in data and make decisions or generate outputs based on those inputs. And a particular type of model that you may have heard about is a large language model or an LLM. So these are models that learn statistical relationships from vast amounts of text. So OpenAI has a model called GPT-4. Facebook developed a model called Llama. And then finally, we have apps or tools. These are consumer-facing applications that provide an interface for users to input data and obtain outputs from models. So one example is OpenAI's ChatGPT, which runs on GPT-4. So GPT-4 is the underlying model, but you actually interface with the app, which is ChatGPT. All right, so all of that is fairly abstract. Let me try to illustrate this graphically by trying to explain how one trains and uses a generative AI model. So you start with an algorithm that's based on what you'd like this AI system to do, right? So perhaps you want it to engage in natural language processing, it receives some input, and it outputs some text in response. So you develop an algorithm, but then this algorithm is trained on a massive amount of training data. And so, for instance, this could be all the text on the internet, for instance. So after a sufficient amount of training, you ultimately end up with a model. So this is the model that actually understands the statistical relationships within the training data. And for present purposes, you might think of a model as GPT-4, so a large language model. All right, so we'd like some sort of app or interface to actually interact with this model. This could be something like ChatGPT, and this allows a user to enter queries or prompts. This runs through the app, access the model, and then some output or content is then produced. So ChatGPT comes back to you with a response. So to make this even more concrete, let's actually do a bit of a demonstration here. So I'm going to stop share on this screen. I'm going to try to share a different screen. All right, so hopefully you can all see this. This is ChatGPT. And so let's say that I want to enter some text here. I'll ask it to write a news article about disinformation in the election. And we'll see what it generates. And so it's pretty amazing, right? So in real time, this is creating a news article about disinformation in the presidential election, and it actually looks quite convincing, right? So it's drawing from a lot of sources from the internet, it's actually making its own connections, and so forth, right? So a very powerful tool. Obviously, this is, one would hope, a factual account. You can also use ChatGPT for creative pursuits. So I'll say, write a story about a frog meeting a phoenix. So again, in real time, this comes up with a story about a frog and a phoenix, right? So, with detail and setting and characters, this could be a good read. And then so let's transition then to try to see the text to image capability. So let's do create a picture of a frog meeting a phoenix. So this might take a little while. This is actually creating a novel picture based on my inputs, and we'll see what it generates. And so there you go. So, this is an image that might be new to the world, but it's literally a frog meeting a phoenix, right? So illustrating the text to image capabilities of generative AI. All right, good. So let me stop sharing that screen. And let me go back to my presentation. All right, so hopefully we're back. All right, so that gives you a flavor of some of the capabilities of generative AI. And so I'd also kind of pre-prepared some images as well. So let's say you want to get even more fantastical. There's a picture of a dragon, unicorn, and a phoenix. I asked a generative AI engine to create a new print ad for a Nike shoe, right? So this shoe does not exist. There is no Nike Air Apex, but this looks like a very kind of compelling advertisement, right? I might actually buy this shoe. And so I also asked a generative AI engine to create a campaign poster for a centrist presidential candidate. And this is what it generated, right? So, by all accounts, a very convincing campaign poster, one that a campaign might actually adopt. All right, so this gives you a flavor of some of the capabilities of this technology. And a lot of my talk today is going to focus on kind of the downsides or the challenges of generative AI, but I think it is worth stressing that there are enormous benefits to this technology. So for instance, generative AI promises to massively enhance productivity. Generative AI could add between 2.6 and $4.4 trillion annually in economic value around the world across numerous use cases, right? So think about how you might want to actually incorporate generative AI in your own work that may actually enhance your productivity. I'll talk about productivity more a bit later in the talk. Generative AI can also improve decision making. So MasterCard, the credit card company, uses generative AI to power chatbots to provide better customer service and detect fraudulent transactions. Generative AI can improve access to information and knowledge, right? So think about how transformative it was when search engines came around and you could basically Google anything. Well, arguably, we're going to take another leap with generative AI and chatbots in terms of accessing information and usable knowledge. All right, so in addition, we can personalize content and experiences, right? So we could have personalized tutorials that are optimized for a particular individual's learning style, right? So, really kind of valuable application of generative AI. This tool can obviously extend human creativity. We can expand literary, artistic, and musical expression. So the image in the bottom right here is actually of a generative AI created image that won an art contest. We can also enable and accelerate software development. So there are generative AI engines that will allow people who don't actually know how to create software code to just describe what they want a software program to do, and then the generative AI engine will create the code. Right, so finally, obviously, generative AI can also amuse and entertain. So this is a prompt I did the other day. Show me a picture of a steampunk medieval knight playing guitar. All right, so again, a number of benefits to generative AI. I don't want to discount the benefits of this amazing technology, but in the balance of my talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the challenges and the kind of legal and social implications of this technology. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to focus first on the inputs to these models and challenges that arise from generative AI training data. All right, so generative AI models have an insatiable appetite for data. So these models, like all machine learning models, require enormous amounts of training data. And in fact, the more training data that's used, the better the model, right? So the better the outcomes. So basically, you want as much data as possible. And so to take one example, GPT-3, which is an earlier version of the model, this underpinning ChatGPT, was trained on 300 billion words or parts of words scraped from the internet, right? So again, an enormous amount of data. And Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook, actually considered buying publisher Simon & Schuster to use its books as training data, right? So, in terms of training a large language model, the more data, the better. Meta was actually going to use basically the entire portfolio of Simon & Schuster books to train its large language model. All right, so this insatiable appetite for data that trains generative AI models gives rise to certain challenges. One of them is the prospect of copyright infringement. So generative AI models that use copyrighted content scraped from the internet as training data may be engaging in massive copyright infringement. So at this point, we need to take a little bit of an aside and talk a bit about copyright, So copyright is a branch of federal intellectual property law that confers exclusive rights on expressive works, right? So books, articles, movies, music, software code, etc., right? So J.K. Rowling has a copyright on the Harry Potter books, and there's a copyright on, the Deadpool and Wolverine movie. All right, and so why do we grant authors exclusive rights? Well, the overarching rationale is that these exclusive rights enhance incentives to create, right? So in the absence of copyright, J.K. Rowling invests several years of her life, writes the Harry Potter books. Other people could just copy these freely, and this would undermine her incentive to engage in creative expression. All right, so the standard for copyright protection is very easy to satisfy. So we focus on originality, right? So this expression must be independently created and exhibit a modicum of creativity. In addition, it must be fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So text on a page, CDs, internet posts, MP3s. So this is a very easy standard to satisfy, right? So consider a New York Times article. The facts in that article are not going to be copyrightable, but the expression is, right? So the particular way that a reporter phrases an idea or expresses an idea, that would be protectable under copyright. Or consider a photograph, right? So you see here a relatively simple, basic photograph, but it's independently created. It exhibits a modicum of creativity with the composition, the rendering, the angle, and so forth. It's fixed in a tangible medium of expression, and so it too would be protected under copyright. So everybody watching this webinar has created copyrighted content in your lifetime, right? Everything from, a short story that you wrote in elementary school to a report that uses some of your own original expression. All right, so copyrights are very easy to obtain and they last a very long time. So there's no application process to a government agency and they last the life of the author plus 70 years, right? So in many cases, most cases, well over a century of duration. All right, so given how easy it is to get a copyright, virtually all content on the internet is copyrighted. News articles, web page text, photos, graphics, blogs, Facebook posts, X posts, YouTube videos, audio files, software code, right? So as long as originality and fixation are satisfied, and these are very easy to satisfy, we have copyrighted content. Well, therein lies the rub, right? So generative AI firms scrape massive amounts of copyrighted content from the internet without authorization to train their models. So they may be engaged in copyright infringement on a massive scale. So here's a headline from a few months ago in the New York Times: how tech giants cut corners to harvest data for AI. OpenAI, Google, and Meta ignored corporate policies, altered their own rules, and discussed skirting copyright law as they sought online information to train their newest artificial intelligence systems. And there are currently over a dozen high-profile infringement suits by copyright owners against generative AI firms. So this includes the New York Times versus Microsoft and OpenAI. So the New York Times is alleging that OpenAI infringed millions of copyrighted New York Times articles in training GPT-3 and 4. Sarah Silverman, the comedian Sarah Silverman, has also sued OpenAI for copyright infringement based on allegedly copying her book. She's basically able to get very close facsimiles of excerpts from her book from prompting ChatGPT, and so she is sued for copyright infringement. This also obviously applies to images as well. So Getty Images owns millions of photographs, and they have sued Stability AI, a text-to-image generator, for training its model on its copyrighted photographs. All right, so I should mention it's unclear if training generative AI models on copyrighted content constitutes something called fair use. So fair use is a safe harbor from copyright law that permits use of copyrighted content without the copyright holder's permission in certain contexts, such as for criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So you'll notice I use a lot of images in this presentation. They're all copyrighted, I have not cleared those copyrights. I'm not paying anybody royalties. I'm relying on fair use. It's unclear if training a generative AI model on copyrighted content also constitutes fair use. And the current uncertainty creates enormous risk for generative AI developers. All right, so what are some possible solutions and paths forward? Well, we might have modifications of terms of service so that major platforms like Meta, Google, and Amazon can use copyrighted user content as training data, right? So they might alter their terms of service so they can use this data, which is already kind of housed on their platforms, to train their generative AI models. There could be a ruling that using copyrighted content for training data constitutes fair use. So certainly OpenAI and other AI firms would love to see that type of ruling. We can also have massive licensing between content owners and AI companies to use copyrighted content as training data. And AI firms are actually engaging in widespread licensing deals. So OpenAI has deals with Vox Media, News Corp, the New York Post, Time, The Atlantic, and other copyright owners as well, right? So this is kind of voluntary licensing to license huge amounts of copyrighted content to train generative AI models. Or there could be a ruling that using copyrighted content as training data constitutes copyright infringement, right? So this would be kind of a seismic blow to the generative AI industry, and they would have to kind of alter their practices quite fundamentally. All right, so copyright infringement is one challenge that arises from the enormous amount of data that generative AI uses. Another set of challenges arises from privacy violations. All right, so again, there are privacy concerns from vast amounts of training data being used to train generative AI models. As noted earlier, GPT-3 was trained on 300 billion words or parts of words scraped from the internet. Blog posts, Facebook posts, tweets, back when they were still called tweets, articles, even things like state voter registration records, right? Think about all of the data that's online. And this includes personal information obtained without consent and used for a different purpose, right? So let's say that you uploaded your CV to a job website in the hopes of getting a new job. Well, it's on the internet, and so that could be used as training data for a generative AI model. So Google rewrote its terms of service to allow broader use of data from Google Docs and other apps to train AI models, right? So, the information that you submit to these companies by way of things like Google Docs, you might think of these as your personal documents. Well, that data could also be used to train AI models. All right, so there are also privacy concerns from user queries, right? So individuals may enter sensitive information when submitting prompts to generative AI platforms. For instance, there may be queries regarding medical advice, psychological counseling, or relationship guidance. And one survey from 2023 revealed that 39% of generative AI users had submitted work information, and over 30% entered names, addresses, or health information, right? So as users are interacting with these platforms, they're entering private information. Think about generative AI at work. So employees may submit private proprietary business information when querying generative AI chatbots. And these queries that are entered by users become additional training data. All right, so this is potentially problematic because we do have data leaks, right? So there could be accidental information disclosure. There could be deliberate attempts to divulge personal information from AI systems. And so research has actually shown that ChatGPT can reveal personal information from real people. And if you extract just a little bit of personal information, you can use that information to try to get more. So we often see the use of personal information to engage in fraud and deception. So spear phishing involves the targeting of people for identity theft and fraud, right? So a little bit of, let's say, personal information is extracted from an AI model that could be used to target someone to get even more information through spear phishing. Similarly, we could have AI voice cloning to impersonate people and extort victims over the phone, right? Imagine if you get a phone call from someone who sounds like your parent or your mom or your dad, you might be likely to be taken advantage of. All right, so the Federal Trade Commission has argued that AI companies that violate their privacy commitments may be liable under laws enforced by the FTC. And the Federal Trade Commission has actually ordered the destruction of training data obtained in violation of privacy laws and the models trained on such data, so-called algorithmic destruction. So there is no general federal legislation that governs data privacy in this country. And so largely this is regulated by the states. California has really taken the lead in data privacy. And so there are a number of laws that one could get into. I'll just mention a couple that were passed just recently. So one requires firms to disclose training data used for AI systems. This includes personal information and aggregate consumer information. Another recently enacted law expands the definition of personal information under the California Consumer Privacy Act to include a broad range of formats, including AI models, right? So there are some attempts to regulate in this area, but the threat remains that generative AI and its insatiable appetite for data threatens privacy or can threaten privacy. All right, so along the lines of challenges that arise from generative AI training data, I now want to talk a little bit about bias. So generative AI applications can be biased, and in fact, they can be biased for many reasons. There could be bias in development teams. So we may have, for instance, the overrepresentation of men on software development teams. And so the demographics of who's actually developing these generative AI systems is not representative of the population in general. We could have bias in the interface design, right? So did you ever wonder why the vast majority of voice assistant chatbots like Siri and Alexa are personified as female, right? So there might be some bias in how we design these interfaces. And there can also be bias in algorithms and models themselves. For instance, word embedding models and natural language processing have associated men with computer programmers and women with homemakers, right? So a lot of sources of bias in generative AI. I'm going to focus on one, which is bias that arises from training data, right? So the data used to train generative AI models may be misrepresentative of reality, or it may accurately reflect a reality that has been shaped by bias and discrimination. Through either mechanism, generative AI models trained on biased data can produce images, text, and other content that perpetuates and exacerbates this bias. So let me give you a few examples, and this has been most prominently researched in the context of text-to-image generators, right? So I put in some text into a generative AI platform, and it outputs images. And so here I'm going to outline an analysis of Stable Diffusion, which is a popular text-to-image generator. So when prompted for an image of a judge, 3% of the images were of women, 97% of them were of men, right? You typically got an image like this, right? So an older white male who's a judge. And, this is kind of a photo of a judge from central casting, which is precisely kind of the problem, right? So only 3% of images that were generated were of women. In reality, 34% of US judges are women, right? So we have biased outputs that actually arise, in this case, from biased inputs. The training data that underlies this text-to-image generator was not representative of society and reality. So another example, so here we have prompts for a fast food worker. You see the image in the lower right, a typical response. 70% of images that arose from this prompt were of people of darker skin tones. in reality, over 70% of fast food workers in the United States are white, right? So again, biased outputs based on biased inputs. All right, so this is from the same study. This is these are prompts for a color photograph of a housekeeper. None of these people are actually real people. These are AI generated images, but you note certain commonalities, certainly with respect to gender, ethnicity. These are kind of stereotypical images of housekeepers. All right, so these are so-called average faces for occupations on Stable Diffusion. So we have 300 instances of prompts for each of these occupations, and I'll just read the occupations. So on the top line, we have high-paying occupations like architect, lawyer, politician, doctor, CEO, judge, and engineer. And in the bottom row, we have low-paying occupations like janitor, dishwasher, fast food worker, cashier, teacher, social worker, and housekeeper. And so what the authors of this study did is they actually created an average of all of the images that are produced when these prompts were entered. And so if you look at the high-paying occupations, you see definite commonalities in terms of male gender. They tend to look more lighter skin tone, with the possible exception of engineer and doctor. If we look at the low-paying occupations and kind of the average face or average image, with the exception of janitor, perhaps dishwasher, largely female, typically darker skin tone, so indicative of people of color, right? So these are results that come out of a very popular text to image generator. And so Stable Diffusion actually said all AI models have inherent biases that are representative of the data sets they are trained on. So here is another analysis. So these are prompts in Stable Diffusion XL. So the prompt here is for attractive people. And here again, you see certain commonalities, right? They tend to be young, thin, of lighter skin tone. And so the authors of this article said, image generators naturally reflect the world of white people because the nonprofit that provides data to many companies, including Lion. So Lion is a data aggregator that provides data to a lot of generative AI firms, doesn't focus on China and India, the largest population of web users. So here's another analysis from the same study. So again, we're talking about prompts in Stable Diffusion XL. And the prompt here is a photo of a house in the United States, China, and India. And again, what you get are very stereotypical images, right? So a very stereotypical house in the United States, a very traditional looking house in China, probably very different from the actual houses that people live in modern day China. In India, you have houses on these dusty roads. It looks somewhat dilapidated. And in the words of Christoph Schumann, who's co-founder of Lion, again, a data aggregator that provides data to generative AI firms, this will give you the average stereotype of what an average person from North America or Europe thinks. All right, so some more prompts. So this is a prompt for a person at social services, returning largely images of people of color. In 2020, 63% of food stamp recipients were white and 27% were Black, right? So these images may not be representative of reality. The prompt here on the right is that of a productive person. You see very kind of corporate looking people. There are obviously many other ways of being productive rather than being in a corporate context, but our results seem to be rather skewed. All right, so what are some implications of automated bias and stereotyping? Well, in the words of some commentators, people learn from seeing or not seeing themselves that maybe they don't belong. AI-generated television and movie scripts, marketing campaigns, and ads may perpetuate stereotypes. Chatbots that are drafting research papers, news articles, and reports may be biased. And incorporating generative AI into virtual sketch artist software that's used by police departments could over-target certain groups based on the skewed nature of the training data that went into training these models. All right, so I now want to transition. We've been talking about challenges that arise from generative AI training data. Now I want to focus more directly on the implications of generative AI outputs, focusing first on productivity and employment. All right, so the good news is that generative AI can enhance worker productivity. So 72% of respondents in a survey of US executives stated that generative AI can play an important role in increasing productivity. Generative AI can automate, streamline, or improve many work tasks, such as producing text, generating graphics, writing code, designing products, creating marketing campaigns, performing legal research, and providing customer service, right? So just think about all the aspects of your work that could be accelerated, automated, improved in some fashion through the use of generative AI. And in fact, there is some empirical research backing up these claims. So empirical research found that generative AI increased productivity for highly skilled consultants, for mid-level professional writing tasks, and customer support agents. All right, so if that's the good news, there's also some potentially bad news, right? So generative AI can threaten jobs. 47% of US executives in that same survey expect generative AI to lead to decreased job security. And jobs centered around repetitive language tasks may have many functions automated, right? So think about customer service that was historically provided by humans working at call centers. These jobs may be displaced by generative AI. So unlike other waves of automation, this is going to affect higher income knowledge workers as well. So think about writers, lawyers, engineers, software programmers. I'm a law professor. I teach at a law school, and people are anxious about what kinds of legal functions could be automated. Is AI going to be your next lawyer? All right, so generative AI can threaten jobs in other ways as well. So we see the adoption of AI and its likely impact are going to vary by industry. So in the media and entertainment industry, this issue has been particularly prominent. So as you may recall, there were strikes recently by writers and actors, and the writers and actors received protections from generative AI in new labor contracts, right? So Hollywood writers were quite understandably concerned that they could be replaced by chatbots that are producing scripts. Actors themselves are concerned that they could be replaced by generative AI created video, and they received certain protections in new labor contracts. In the video game industry, we've seen particularly rapid adoption of AI and some evidence of layoffs. So concept artists, graphic designers, and illustrators have been laid off. Other industries and other types of jobs that may be particularly impacted by generative AI include clerical and administrative work, financial services, and software development. All right, and so in addition to job displacement in general, job displacement may amplify existing inequalities. In high-income nations, generative AI is predicted to automate about 8% of women's occupations and only about 3% of men's occupations. 24% of Black workers are employed in jobs with a high chance of automation, compared with 20% of white workers, right? So the job displacement effects of generative AI will not be equally felt by all groups in society. All right, so more broadly, generative AI may change the nature of work, right? So, generative AI can increase productivity. It can also threaten jobs, but it can also just fundamentally change the nature of work. And in many contexts, generative AI will augment rather than replace jobs. So the use of generative AI for automatable tasks may free up time for higher value activities, right? So in law, for instance, generative AI might do kind of document review, and actually free up time for lawyers to engage in higher value activities like developing a litigation strategy. And so this may actually make work more personally rewarding. So returning to that survey of US executives, 66% said implementing generative AI would require both hiring new talent and training existing talent. 39% believe that generative AI could lead to decreased social interactions and human connections, right? So changing the nature of work in arguably a negative direction. All right, so it is the case that the willingness of workers to adopt generative AI varies by industry, age, and expertise. So one study found that younger and less experienced workers were more likely to use ChatGPT. What can be done about all of this? Well, firms can strengthen internal workforce planning and invest in reskilling and upskilling workers. Policymakers may want to devote more attention to developing education and training programs to prepare workers for jobs that will benefit from artificial intelligence. All right, so next, again, continuing this theme of focusing on the effects of generative AI outputs, I want to talk a bit about misinformation, disinformation, and fraud. All right, so in terms of misinformation, generative AI can hallucinate. It can just make things up. So have you ever wondered what's the world record for crossing the English Channel entirely on foot? That was what ChatGPT said. According to the Guinness World Records, the fastest time for crossing the English Channel entirely on foot is 12 hours and 10 minutes. This record was set by George Reef in 2016. You know, this sounds like very useful information. The problem is that it's completely made up. It's completely wrong. It's fabricated. This is an AI hallucination. This never actually happened. So similarly, a user prompted Google Gemini to generate images of a German soldier in 1943, and this is what Gemini produced. I'm no historian, but I think that image on the right may not be entirely historically representative. All right, so hallucinations are false or misleading outputs of generative AI models. According to one study, chatbots hallucinate 3 to 27% of the time, and this arises from a number of causes. So there could be limitations of training data, defects in the algorithm, unusual prompts, right? So Bing and Bard had a lot of problems with misinformation. Have you ever wondered what the capital of Mars is? According to one chatbot, the capital of Mars is Muskland. All right, so there are significant risks that arise here for the use of generative AI for work, school, journalism, research, and content production. The fact that generative AI can just hallucinate and make things up. So here's one real world example that actually relates back to my earlier discussion about productivity and employment. There's a case called Mata versus Avianca from New York, where an attorney filed a brief citing half a dozen cases that were just made up by ChatGPT. This was an actual court filing. And the judge imposed sanctions of $5,000 for bad faith and making false and misleading statements, right? So some real potential hazards from using generative AI at work. All right, so that's misinformation. I now want to focus on disinformation, which is false information intended to mislead. And so one example is deepfakes that are created by generative AI and that are surprisingly convincing. So at your leisure, hop onto YouTube. You can find a variety of deepfakes featuring someone who looks and sounds just like Tom Cruise. It's eerie how effective these deepfakes really are. So we are in an election season, obviously, and disinformation has significant political implications. Personalized real-time chatbots could share conspiracy theories in increasingly credible and persuasive ways. Researchers say GPT-3, right? So the large language model that underlies ChatGPT or an earlier version of ChatGPT could be prompted to produce polemics in the style of mass shooters, forum threads discussing Nazism, and defenses of QAnon, right? So generative AI could be used to create disinformation with important political implications. So here's one example I found. It's a generative AI created image of Donald Trump being rather violently arrested, right? This obviously did not happen. This is an artificial image, but this could incite quite a bit of public controversy and alarm if it were widely disseminated and people actually thought it was real. It certainly looks quite realistic. All right, so there have been instances of generative AI deepfakes that have been aimed at manipulating elections. So there was fake video of Moldova's pro-Western president supporting a political party that favors Russian interests. There was fabricated audio of a political leader in Slovakia talking about rigging elections and increasing the price of beer. And here in the United States, there have been robocalls sounding like President Biden advising New Hampshire voters to abstain from voting in the January primary election. All right, so this is an area that's very difficult to regulate. So California actually recently enacted a law restricting the use of digitally altered political deepfakes, but a federal judge recently blocked that law as violating the First Amendment, right? So the litigation was brought by somebody who created a deepfake advertisement that was really kind of ridiculing Kamala Harris. So this law was struck down, but the court did allow provisions requiring the verbal disclosure of digitally altered content in audio-only recordings, right? So Elon Musk, as you probably would not be surprised to hear, actually did not like this law, and he's actually recirculated the deepfake that features Kamala Harris. All right, so in terms of fraud, there are lots of potentially fraudulent applications of generative AI. I want to talk for a moment about one of them, which is academic dishonesty. So 89% of students over the age of 18 have used ChatGPT to help with a homework assignment. And I want to suggest that all of those uses were academically dishonest, but schools are relying on services like Turnitin to detect text generated by AI. There certainly is a temptation for students to use generative AI to do their homework and to do their school assignments. Universities are adopting policies on the use of AI. And this raises, I think, a central question, which is how to differentiate plagiarism from the legitimate use of generative AI to improve education and learning. There are lots of ways in which generative AI can really accelerate and improve learning. How do you differentiate that from instances where it can facilitate academic dishonesty? All right, so finally, in terms of considering the outputs of generative AI, I want to talk a little bit about authorship and inventorship and return to intellectual property. So when generative AI creates an expressive work or an invention, can it be protected by intellectual property rights? If so, by whom? And this is an issue that authorities are grappling with in the current landscape. So Chris Kashtanova utilized generative AI engine Midjourney to create the images for a comic book called Zarya of the Dawn. Right? So all of the images in this comic book were created by generative AI. And she applied to register this copyright with our Copyright Office. Well, the Copyright Office rejected the registration. So copyright protection requires authorship, right? So earlier I talked a bit about originality, fixation in a tangible medium of expression. Another requirement of copyright protection is authorship. And the Copyright Office interpreted this to require human authorship. And so images in a comic book created by generative AI, they don't satisfy human authorship, and as such, they are not copyrightable. If you step back and think about this has some significant implications. So content created entirely by generative AI falls in the public domain. It can't be copyrighted because it doesn't satisfy the authorship requirement of copyrightability. As such, it can be freely copied. So we're talking about movie scripts, images, music, videos, etc. And the central question that arises here is, how much help can a person receive from generative AI and still qualify for human authorship, right? So if generative AI is wholly responsible for the image, the Copyright Office has said, no human authorship, no copyright. But what if I use generative AI as an assistant? Can I still retain human authorship and get a copyright on that image? Copyrights deal with expressive works. We see analogous situations involving technologies and patent law. So here we're implicating the patent law concept of inventorship. So Stephen Thaler invented a system called DABIT. It's an AI system that basically was an inventing machine. And so DABIT conceived of two novel inventions, a food container and a flashing beacon, about which Thaler had no expertise, right? So Thaler is inventing an AI system, which then invents things, and then Thaler applied for patents on DABIT's creations, right? So we talked earlier about copyrights. Copyrights are exclusive rights on expressive works. Patents are exclusive rights on technologies to promote incentives to invent. So we have an AI system basically inventing new technologies. Can they be patented? The Patent and Trademark Office rejected Thaler's applications. So very analogous to the copyright situation, it ruled that patent protection requires inventorship, which it interpreted as human inventorship, and as such, DABIT's inventions were not patentable. But this again gives rise to a question that's very similar to one we encounter in the copyright context. How much artificial assistance can an inventor receive while preserving the patentability of an invention? All right, so I want to end the talk by talking a bit about outputs as inputs, right? So we talked about inputs, challenges from generative AI training data. We talked about the outputs of generative AI itself. Well, what if generative AI outputs are then used as the inputs to train generative AI? So this gives rise to the concept of synthetic data. All right, so let's return to our understanding of how to train and use a generative AI model, right? So you start with an algorithm. It's trained with an enormous amount of training data. This yields the model that actually understands the statistical relationships within the data set. You have some sort of interface that allows for queries or prompts from a user, and this yields some output, right? So this output was created by the generative AI models. What if that output then becomes the input? What if it becomes the training data to then train another AI model, including another generative AI model? So this gives rise to the concept of synthetic training data. So synthetic data is artificially created data, such as text, numerical values, images, and videos, right? So these are the outputs of generative AI. And there's very much a recursive character here. Generative AI models create synthetic data, which then trains other AI models, which may include generative AI models. And Gartner estimates that by the end of this year, 60% of the data used to train AI models will be synthetic. So what are the implications of generative AI created synthetic training data? Well, there are a lot of benefits that may arise from synthetic data. So this gives rise to the prospect of the creation of large amounts of high quality data on demand. As we know, AI models require huge amounts of training data. The more training data, the better the model. We can use generative AI to just synthesize enormous amounts of data on demand. This can, in theory, address privacy concerns. So AI models could be trained on fictitious medical records, fake financial transactions, and other synthetic data, right? So not data that actually identifies real people. This could also mitigate bias in automated decision-making. So we can fill in the gaps of real-world data sets for underrepresented populations, right? So, instead of having biased data that leads to biased outputs, we can actually fill in the gaps and increase the representation of traditionally underrepresented people, groups, images in training data. This can also, in theory, avoid copyright infringement. So we could train generative AI models on synthetic text and images rather than copyrighted content. Now, one caveat here, synthetic data may simply shift copyright issues kind of upstream. Synthetic data itself may in some circumstances infringe others' copyrights or itself be copyrighted. All right, so what are some implications of generative AI created synthetic data? Well, high quality synthetic data can massively increase the analytic power of machine learning models for good or ill, right? So we could have more accurate diagnosis of diseases through AI models that are trained on huge amounts of synthetic data. We can also have more accurate facial detection, facial recognition technology. We could have more powerful mechanisms for creating behavioral advertising that nudges us to buy things we don't really want or need. We could have more convincing deepfakes. We could have more fake news, more disinformation by increasing the analytic power of generative AI through high quality synthetic data. So low quality synthetic data can also give rise to some problems. It may be too similar to reality. Uh, it may leak private information. It may amplify real world biases, right? So to the extent that some real world data set is biased and we kind of synthesize more data that replicates those biases, then we're going to amplify those biases in the outputs. So low quality synthetic data may be too different from reality. So IBM's Watson Health was trained on faulty synthetic data and gave incorrect cancer treatment advice. Obviously, a very dangerous outcome. So low quality synthetic data can also lead to something called model collapse. So this is a degenerative process where synthetic data pollutes the training set for new AI models, which create more synthetic data. So in essence, we have a generative AI model that creates synthetic data that then becomes the training set for another AI model, which creates more synthetic data that's kind of perpetuating this loop. So here's one analysis that involves, at the outset, actual handwritten digits. So these are fed into a generative AI model that's supposed to create outputs that look like actual handwritten digits. So here's the output after one generation, where artificially created data was then submitted as its training data. We repeat this process, and here's the AI output after 30 generations, right? We are really kind of divorced from reality because we've been using low quality synthetic data as a training data for these generative AI models. All right, so let me just conclude here. Generative AI is a transformative technology that will revolutionize many aspects of society. It can enhance productivity, streamline access to information, personalize content and experiences, extend human creativity, and amuse and entertain. But it also gives rise to significant legal and social challenges. There are challenges that arise from generative AI's insatiable appetite for training data, such as copyright infringement, privacy violations, and bias and stereotyping. Focusing more directly on the effects and implications of generative AI outputs, generative AI can increase productivity. It can also eliminate jobs. It can fundamentally change the nature of work. It can lead to misinformation, disinformation, and fraud. And it gives rise to complications with respect to authorship and inventorship, the IP protection of generative AI outputs. And finally, generative AI creating synthetic data to train other AI models can itself create both significant benefits and harms. So with that, I'll close. I want to thank you for your attention, and I will now transition to hearing your questions and comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. This is a fantastic presentation. And we actually have a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to try to do something a little bit experimental here. And I tried to organize the questions by kind of category. And I'm going to actually try to paste the questions in the Q&A box. So maybe you can follow along. And I will doing that now. So if you want to take a look, any attendee or are you, Dr. Lee, to look in the answered section of the Q&A box, we have, I believe, there's quite a few questions, so I didn't paste them all, but I'm going to start with question number one. And we have a number of folks asking if the slide deck will be made available separately from the presentation. So as an FYI, the presentation is being recorded, and it will be made available to registered attendees as a link, and it will be made available on the State Library's YouTube page. But I'm wondering if you're willing to share the slide deck separately for attendees.
Absolutely. So I'm more than happy to share this. I will share it with you, and then please post it wherever you see appropriate. But yeah, very happy to share the slides.
Okay, so our next question, it's more kind of a category of kind of the development of AI and its general applications. So this question, and I've combined a few, so let's hope they make sense to everybody. So question number 2, how can AI benefit different types of government agencies, both the ones that are public focused and those operating more kind of privately like businesses?
Sure. So a couple responses there. So the question is where to just focus on AI in general, and AI can certainly, automate a lot of back office processes, enhance efficiency. Focusing for a moment on generative AI, any type of work function that involves creating some sort of content, drafting a report, performing some analysis, generating graphics, generating, let's say a public health campaign, anything that requires the generation of content can really be benefited by generative AI. Obviously, as I mentioned in the talk, one always has to be concerned about hallucinations and misinformation. So if you do use generative AI in your work, please be sure to check that it's factually accurate. But what I find from a lot of people is that what's very useful is for generative AI to produce the first draft of something, right? So the first draft of a report, the first draft of an article, for instance, and then that's really the basis upon which you can then refine the content, check its factual accuracy, and tailor it. But really, any type of job function that requires the production of content can benefit from generative AI.
Okay, perfect. So the next question is a very interesting one. So generative AI has been around for a while. What recent developments led to this current AI boom?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. So there are really three primary drivers of kind of innovation in the AI space. So one is the sophistication of the algorithms themselves. Another one is the availability of data. So as I mentioned, training data is very important for training these models. And finally, there is computing power, right? So you need an enormous amount of computing power to run these models and to develop these models. And so we've really seen a convergence of these three trends really in the past, 5 years or so. As I mentioned, AI has been around for decades, but with increasing sophistication of algorithms, um, enhanced computing power, and really the widespread availability of training data, and really kind of the ability to scrape the internet for seemingly limitless, although it is not limitless, but enormous amounts of training data, these three trends have really kind of converged to create this moment where AI is really booming. And then obviously this feeds into the entire ecosystem of entrepreneurial finance and venture capital. A number of AI firms are getting enormous VC funding now, and this accelerates this boom in artificial intelligence.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is kind of in a general category that I've titled like legal and copyright concerns. So question 4 is, in your opinion, what are the most pressing legal concerns with AI, especially regarding copyright and data use?
Sure. So the one I'd highlight is the one that I spent a bit of time talking about today. There is the very real possibility that these generative AI platforms are engaged in massive copyright infringement. So millions, perhaps billions of pieces of copyrighted content are being used as training data without the authorization of the content holders. And so, this could have enormous implications for the future of generative AI. As I noted, there are a number of lawsuits now that are accusing generative AI firms of engaging in massive copyright infringement. If these cases turn out unfavorably for generative AI firms, that is, courts find that this is copyright infringement, then we could have industry-altering liability. So it's somewhat reminiscent of what happened with file sharing about 15, 20 years ago. So, if you'll recall, there were a number of very prominent file sharing systems, like Morpheus, Napster, Grokster, and so forth. And literally millions, maybe billions of pieces of copyrighted content were being circulated on these file sharing systems. And we had copyright infringement on an enormous scale. And we had a series of cases that actually found that these file sharing systems were liable for copyright infringement. And a number of them went out of business, or they had to radically change their business model. And so really the future of the generative AI industry, I think, hinges on these issues of copyright infringement. One thing I'll add, so in my talk, I focused on copyright infringement in terms of infringing copyrights in the training data, and that's a really big issue. Another issue that I didn't have time to address is on the output side. So when a generative AI system produces some text or an image, that output may also infringe an existing copyright, right? So let's say that, I use a text-to-image generator to produce an image of, I don't know, Kamala Harris, and it looks a lot like a copyrighted photograph of Kamala Harris. Well, if it's substantially similar, I could have infringement on the output side as well, right? So both from the input side and the output side, I think that whether these firms are engaged in massive copyright infringement will really kind of be very important in shaping the future of generative AI.
Okay, thank you for that. I am actually going to skip ahead to a few additional questions, especially ones that were asked by multiple people. So how do we balance AI's benefits against its potential negative impacts? One that was mentioned a lot in the Q&A was AI services requiring large amounts of energy.
Right. So it's a great question. And there have been a lot of conversations and debates about this at all levels of government, so notably state government and the federal government. So, I think that there is this desire to exploit the tremendous upside of this technology, right, in terms of enhancing productivity, enhancing access to knowledge, information, what have you. But as I've outlined for almost an hour, there are significant challenges as well. So, you know, one one approach that's been getting a lot of attention is so-called AI guardrails, right? So we want this technology to develop robustly, but we want to have some constraints on what it actually does. And so these external constraints can help balance the benefits against the harms. One kind of type of guardrail might be one relating to disclosure, right? So there have been some jurisdictions that have emphasized a need on the part of generative AI firms to be more transparent about their training data, disclose where it comes from, and to the extent possible, it's hard because it's an enormous amount of data, but to disclose its contents. And so, for instance, we could have initiatives whereby generative AI firms are required to disclose the extent to which their data may include copyrighted information or private personal information, right? So these disclosure requirements may be helpful as well. There is some concern that AI kind of run amok can actually pose substantial existential threats to humanity. And so, there are people who are very interested in these questions and developing policies to kind of cabin a bit the operation of AI. One approach in this regard is kind of constitutional AI. So, we normally think about AI as kind of this free learning entity, but we can kind of create, almost in a hardwired sense, these kind of internal constitutions, these rules within AI systems that they absolutely cannot breach. Like, this AI system cannot do anything that will directly harm a human being. So the energy question is an important one. So a lot of energy is consumed in training these models and in the application, the use of AI models. I'd say there is some promise for technological interventions here. I talked about large language models. More recently, small language models have arisen that actually use less data to achieve similar results. And this arises primarily from greater sophistication in the algorithms themselves. But to the extent that you have smaller models that require less data, energy consumption should go down as well. But this is certainly an important area that needs further investigation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to skip over some of the other more specific questions about AI in training data and whatnot, because you did touch on a lot of that. But one interesting question is they wanted you to talk a little bit more about the tools that exist to detect AI generated content across various media, and how reliable are they? One commenter talked about how Grammarly has been known to essentially falsely claim that students were using AI generated content and actually causing harm to students and making them on academic probation and whatnot for kind of inaccurate AI generated checks.
Sure. So that is a very legitimate concern. So they mentioned, particularly in the context of schools, people are using tools like Turnitin to try to detect generative AI created text. As the commentator suggested, however, they're not entirely accurate. So we can have both false positives and false negatives. And this is kind of going to be almost an instance of spy versus spy, right? So, as these generative AI detecting tools become more sophisticated, there is an incentive for generative AI firms to create content that makes it harder to detect. And so we're going to have this kind of arms race in terms of developing technology that either detects AI or evades such detection. So it is not entirely reliable. And it's an area where, unfortunately, there are going to be greater technological challenges going forward because the sophistication of the generative AI content itself is going to be so great. It's going to take more advanced detectors to try to understand this actually artificially created.
Okay, great. Another question, I'll go in a different direction here. Somebody wanted you to speak about the current inability to copyright AI generated materials and whether that's slowed AI adoption in creative industries, book covers, music, etc.
Sure. So it's a great question. It kind of relates to the latter portion of what I was speaking about. So the Copyright Office has said that content that's entirely generated by AI fails the authorship requirement of copyrightability and is thus not protected under copyright. So this was Zari of the Dawn, the comic book that I discussed. So this does leave some wiggle room, however, in terms of using generative AI as an assistant to create some output, in which case that output may still be copyrightable, right? So the Copyright Office has said, for instance, that to the extent that there is significant human creativity in the inputs, right? So, and there actually is quite a bit of creativity in the prompts that you use to submit to a generative AI platform. So if there is, this significant human creativity on the input side with respect to the prompts, and if generative AI tools work fairly predictably, then the outputs really kind of, are more proximate to the creativity of the human himself or herself. And as such, authorship would be satisfied and that output could be copyrighted, right? So, think about Adobe Photoshop, for instance. So, this is a tool. This is a tool that artists can use to create works of art, and those works are copyrightable. But that's because there is a proximate relationship between the creativity of the human individual and the output. If the generative AI engine is doing the lion's share of the creativity here, and is actually creating outputs that are unpredictable to the human inputter, then that suggests that we don't have human authorship and that we have something that's not copyrightable. If, on the other hand, the inputs are very creative, generative AI works fairly predictably, there is more of a nexus between that human creativity and the output, and so we have copyrightability. So all of that is to say that there are some kinds of content that are generated with the assistance of generative AI that would still qualify for copyright protection. So another example is, let's say that you use a generative AI platform to create some content. It could be a song or an image, but then you as a human manipulate that. You change it, right? So you add your own originality, you add your own creativity. That output may still be copyrightable. Another example, this actually relates to the Zarya of the Dawn examples. Let's say that you have a compilation of generative AI created images. Well, the images themselves may not be copyrightable, but you may have actually introduced the requisite amount of originality in the selection and arrangement of those images. So the compilation overall is copyrightable. So there are ways in which AI-assisted content can be copyrightable, and this may help explain why we've seen some uptake in the content industry. So you see a lot of AI-generated music, AI-generated videos, AI-generated scripts, but it is still going to be the case that if something is wholly generated by AI, it's not going to satisfy that authorship requirement of copyrightability. And this actually creates a financial disincentive for a large studio or a publisher or a music label to rely on wholly AI-generated content because it can't then enjoy exclusive rights around that content and it can't commercialize it as easily. So complications still to be worked out in the future, but we actually do see some rather pervasive uptake in the content industries.
Thank you very much. And I think we only have time for one more, and I am going to choose one that came in a little bit later just because it's something that we've been talking quite a bit about in our agency. So because most government documents, data, work products, emails, etc., notes can be accessed through Public Records Act requests. Are there confidentiality concerns for inputting these types of documents into generative AI to create content?
So I'd say absolutely yes, right? So, private information, confidential information enters these AI systems through a number of mechanisms. One is the training data, but the other is the queries from users themselves, right? So, you actually have instances of people inputting confidential information at work into generative AI systems. And this relates to something else I talked about, right? So we want to use generative AI to enhance our productivity at work. We might have to submit business information to the generative AI platform. But once it's in there, it's almost impossible to get it out, right? So that confidential information remains part of the model. And there are ways in which people have been able to access particular bits of information from generative AI models. So, this is something that people need to be very careful about. And I would generally shy away from inputting sensitive confidential information in my query to a generative AI platform.
Okay, well, with that, I am going to give you a break. Thank you so much for answering all of these complex and rapid fire questions. And I think that's it for Q&A. And thanks to everybody for submitting some really fantastic and engaging questions.
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate it.
All right. Thank you again to Professor Lee for your wonderful presentation. Thank you, Vanessa, for monitoring our Q&A so well. And thank you all for attending. If you're ever in the area, please visit the State Library in person at 914 Capitol Mall in Sacramento. We're open Monday through Friday, 9:30 to 4 p.m. Thank you all for attending and have a great afternoon.